Colombian cocaine.
That was a brilliant comparison. Brilliant comparison.
Oh, but this is exactly what Britain did, and China. They don't forget that. And now, what this has practically meant is that starting around 20 years ago, but really 10 years ago intensively, the United States strategists, if you could call them that, said China's rise is a threat to the United States because China's a big country. And so we have to take measures to stop China's rise. This is a kind of insanity, actually, because it's exactly what leads to wars. It's not the business of the United States to try to stop China's rise, but that's precisely what they are doing through unilateral tariff measures, blocking China's exports to the U.S., blocking American investments in China, taking measures like this stupid one last month where the U.S. Congress voted that TikTok has to either close or sell its operations to an American company. The U.S. went after Huawei, which is an excellent company, very innovative, very dynamic, and that's precisely why the U.S. attacked it, because it was too successful. The U.S. has stopped the sale of advanced semiconductors to China. The U.S. thinks this is normal, but the most dangerous point is the U.S. is doing in Taiwan what it did in Ukraine. For Ukraine, this is core Russian security. For the United States to say we're going to move our military into Ukraine is a direct and immediate threat to Russian security, a point that Putin has made for basically 20 years. In the case of China, Taiwan is the same security threat for China, especially after the period from 1839 to 1949, where imperial powers continued to invade China, threaten Chinese unity, carve off pieces of China as part of Japan's empire, and so on. China says, don't meddle in our unity. And that's why when countries establish diplomatic relations with China, they must adopt the one China policy, which says you are not going to try to separate pieces of China and divide our country again, as you did for a century, from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th century. Taiwan looms very large in that story because Taiwan, actually both Taiwan and mainland China, the People's Republic of China, both have in their founding documents, the Republic of China in Taipei says there's one China. They disagree who should run it, but it's one China. But when the United States established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, it adopted the one China policy, that Taiwan is part of China. And yet it plays games, worse than games, extremely dangerous measures, saying, well, we're going to have a trade agreement with Taiwan. We're going to have arms agreements with Taiwan. We're going to support Taiwan's security, all while Taiwan is supposed to be part of China. And the United States ignores mainland China on this, ignores the People's Republic of China. Well, this is absolutely heading towards a war if the U.S. continues this. And I can't emphasize enough how stupid our Congress members are. They're people that are completely irresponsible. They don't know any history. They come from someplace in America, thousands of miles away from China. They've never been to China. But boy, they know everything about China. and they know that they're going to send weapons to Taiwan and they're going to protect Taiwan. And what they are doing is leading us closer and closer to war. And in the United States, in our press, this idea of a war with China is being normalized. It's mentioned almost every day in some news story. Oh, maybe there'll be a war with China, as if this isn't one of the greatest insanities one could imagine, because this would be potentially the end of the world. Yet the American mainstream media normalizes a war with Russia or normalizes a war with China as if this is absolutely normal and necessary, because after all, the United States needs to be number one in the world, and it's going to do what it needs to do to be number one. And in the meantime, this is what's leading to chaos in so many places.
Exactly. It's horrible. I would say that there was nothing similar so far in the, let's say, in the history. You remember the Caribbean crisis. The leaders of both Washington and Moscow, at a certain moment, they understood that this is the red line. They should not cross at any, let's say, situation or circumstances. They were clever enough to stop from both sides, and this lecture, this lesson, was taken as something of a key importance for next many decades. Now, as if this is a taboo. It's unbelievable. I mean.
Yeah, although I would say the following. You know, I've studied the Cuban Missile Crisis for a long time, tried to understand it. The truth is, we were extraordinarily lucky to get out of that alive. And it is, in the U.S. case, most of Kennedy's, John F. Kennedy's top advisors wanted to go to war. They wanted to have a military approach. Mm-hmm. It was almost only Kennedy and a couple of others, Adlai Stevenson and a couple of others, said, no, we need a diplomatic way out. Mm-hmm. On the Soviet side, there was actually more prudence. I don't think Gromyko wanted a war, and Nikita Khrushchev certainly didn't want a war. And in fact, when he put the missiles into Cuba in 1962, Gromyko said, what is this? Are we going to war? And Khrushchev said, no, we're not going to war, but we're just going to we're going to teach the Americans a little bit of their own medicine because they have missiles in Turkey. We're going to show them what it's like. But it was a big miscalculation because it almost led to the end of the world. But Khrushchev and Kennedy had the sense to pull back. But I'm not sure that our politicians today have that sense. Honest to God, I have to tell you, there are so many stupid and irresponsible American politicians. You can't even believe it. They don't care about war. They talk about war as normal. They want to send so many Ukrainians to their deaths because they even say the Ukraine war is wonderful. No Americans are dying, as if 500,000 Ukrainians aren't enough dead, and as if the risk of nuclear war isn't great enough. So I'm very worried. In the United States system, so much power resides in the president. We've had a string of very mediocre to poor to dangerous presidents over the last 20 years. None of them has risen to the occasion. None. This is really very worrisome because our political system is broken. It's corrupted. It's not bringing the best people to the forefront by any means. Our two lead candidates right now, I regard Biden's presidency as a failure because he doesn't understand diplomacy. He's also 81 and he's too old for this job. And Trump is a very unstable person. These are our two lead candidates. This is something terrible for the world. And in the meantime, so many European leaders, I think, including in the Czech Republic, say, oh, yes, we follow the United States. That's our greatest ally. We have to do whatever the United States does. And don't people realize, don't do that. Be careful. You know, Europe needs Europe needs its own strategy, and it needs a strategy of peace, not a strategy of war.
Exactly. Tell me, as an American, after all these critical formulations, where is the break-even point, or how to call it, which would bring your political class, your political elite, to an understanding that the policies based on the obsessive primacies, let's say, targets and so on, are not realistic, and that a win-win strategy is the only, let's say, realistic option, which will be very good also for the United States. When and where this moment would come?
It's very important to know this and very hard to answer this. I can't imagine Biden or Trump leading that. And yet these are the two leading candidates right now. Neither of them has an understanding or realistic vision of the world. Neither of them has the idea that the world should be unified and in peace so that it can address problems together. None of them has the idea that the U.S. and China should cooperate with each other because it's the two most powerful countries, and the worst thing in the world would be a war, even a Cold War, but a hot war between them is unimaginable. And so how this is going to happen and when is really a major puzzle. And what I believe is the case is that only the U.S., to get out of this peacefully, has to listen to public opinion. I work at the UN every day. At the UN, it's clear that the vast majority of countries in the world want peace and cooperation, and they don't want to choose sides between the U.S. and China or between the U.S. and Russia. They don't want to choose sides. They don't want to impose sanctions on Russia. They don't want to go to war against Russia because the U.S. tells them to do so. So I'm trying to explain to American public opinion and to American politicians that they're running against the whole spirit of the whole world. The U.S. is becoming increasingly isolated. One of the problems is, though, so much of Europe follows the U.S. blindly right now. And this is a puzzle for me because Europe's smarter than the U.S. It has more bad experience also in war. It should understand that this is a dead end. And Europe should understand, of course, that American hegemony or American primacy is not Europe's advantage. Europe is going to benefit from a multipolar world in which Europe is one of the poles of power, creativity, insight, and diplomacy, not as a vassal state of NATO. And yet the European leaders are very bad at this right now. You look at van der Leyen, she's, in my view, nothing but a U.S. bureaucrat, basically. Yes, I find it very, very sad. And European foreign policy is basically do what the U.S. says. And if the U.S. blows up the Nord Stream pipeline, endangering the European economy, everybody pretends it didn't happen. Or pretends that it was Russia that blew up its own pipeline or some other crazy idea like that.
Yeah. One more specific question, if you allow me. You have in the States the act called FARA or FARA, Foreign Agents Regulation Act or something like this. There is a similar law in Russia, in Israel, and so on. And frankly speaking, in the countries like the Czech Republic, there's a growing interest in that maybe we should have something similar, because these as if NGOs, which are led by people from George Soros and so on, they are, let's say, playing their own games beyond any legal, let's say, democratic procedures and so on. And in other countries, like, say, Georgia now, there is a big dispute whether the country can have a law which would, let's say, regulate somehow the activities of similar entities. What is your opinion upon this?
My opinion is very clear, which is the United States should stop meddling in the politics of other countries. Because what this is about is not simply NGOs. This is about politics. This is about U.S. money, official and quasi-private, because even these NGOs are aligned with the U.S. government. But this is about U.S. money turning the politics of other countries, even stoking unrest like the Maidan in Ukraine was a U.S.-funded operation. How do I know? Because they told me, because I saw it with my own eyes. U.S. Improper involvement in what was a coup. I saw it, and I hated it. And I have to say that this is what's happening in Georgia, too. The U.S. says, oh, this is an infringement of Georgian rights. The infringement of Georgian rights is that the U.S. is meddling in Georgian politics. The U.S. should keep out of Georgian politics, and with all respect, Georgians should keep out of American politics.
Exactly.
So this is the basic point. And these laws are put in place to try to stop the meddling. We had senators go to the Maidan and chant to the people there, "We're with you, we're on your side," and so forth. Imagine if Chinese politicians had come to Donald Trump's rally on January 6th, 2021. Do you think the American people would say, "Oh, that's fine. Isn't that nice? Other countries are getting involved in our riots or our demonstrations or our protests or whatever"? No, the United States would not like it at all. It would drive our politics crazy. And indeed, even the false charges of Russian involvement in U.S. politics drove American politics crazy. But it's very important to understand, when you are an empire like the United States, double standards is the basic principle. The basic principle. You don't have to be consistent. You do what you tell others not to do. And the U.S. meddles everywhere in the world through the National Endowment of Democracy, the National Democratic Institute, USAID, NGOs. I know it. I've seen it with my own eyes. It's not good. It's not healthy. This is what's going on right now.
Last question. I'm too much consuming of your time. There is a category of enemy images. We understand, most of us, what does it mean. And this is an even ever bigger instrument in the dirty games, which are pushing the world to very critical, if not dangerous, let's say, situations. What can we, Jeff, do, let's say, against these enemy images? And could we somehow cooperate across the Atlantic in these efforts?
We need to cooperate globally, because we need to bring in Chinese colleagues, Russian colleagues, African colleagues, Latin American colleagues. We hear so much falsity. I almost never hear the truth from the U.S. government anymore. I know the situation with my own eyes all over the world, because that's my work. My work is to be abroad. My work is to be engaged in discussions with governments all over the world. That's what it means to work with the United Nations and on international objectives. And so I hear directly many things, and I can see with my own eyes and hear with my own ears that the U.S. is lying so much of the time. Now, the mainstream media generally repeats these lies. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the main cable networks. This is a big problem, because the public hears a false view of things. And in Europe, it's been the same ever since the Ukraine war broke out. If you say anything that says, well, there's a background to it, there's a history to it, there should have been peace, this has to do with NATO, immediately you're branded, you're a Putin apologist, you're a fool, you get on Ukraine's hate list, many things, all to shut down debate. Same thing is happening with respect to Israel right now. Israel is committing terrible war crimes, I believe genocide. But if you say so, oh no, you're violating every standard, every norm. So truth is really at a premium right now, and that's why what you're doing and alternative outlets are so important, because and it's probably the big benefit of the digital age in this regard. There are many downsides, but at least we have the chance to hear a wider range. You have to search for it. It's not going to come in the mainstream media. And interestingly, we had Tucker Carlson in the United States interview President Putin, and he was attacked by all the mainstream. How dare you do that? And yet hundreds of millions of people watch that, apparently. And that is amazing, because people want to hear themselves. They don't want to hear it through these government propaganda outlets, basically. So this is what we really need to do. It's hard, and the dangers are very high right now, because we're really in the midst of a very, very serious crisis, which, as I've explained, I believe the United States has done the most to instigate, actually. And we need diplomacy just to stay alive. And if we can stay alive and stop the worst, then we can work on getting the truth out too.
I'm an economist. I'm not a conservation biologist or a specialist in your topic of integrative conservation. But I am working with the United Nations actively every day to try to implement the globally agreed goals that we have set for sustainable development. So I'm constantly wondering about and worrying about how we can actually achieve what we have set out to achieve. Now, the basic problem is that our institutional framework, our politics and our economic institutions, are not aligned with sustainable development. They are not aligned with conservation. They are not aligned with stabilizing the climate. They are not aligned with protecting biodiversity. So we are in the middle of a crisis. The crisis has been underway for many decades. It's already more than 30 years since the world governments adopted 3 major environmental agreements. The first on climate change, the UNFCCC, or the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second, the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the third, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. And these were adopted back in the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. We are more than 30 years later, and not one of these treaties is actually being implemented successfully. The reasons are complex, but the basic problem is that the international market economy and our geopolitical environment, the way that governments interact, does not lead to success so far. Time is also very short, because when we're dealing with biological conservation or climate change, it's not only a matter of delay, it's a matter of irreversibilities that we are facing. If we drive species to extinction, as far as we know, we're not going to recover them. If we exceed climate limits, we are not easily going to recover a safe climate. In both circumstances of ecosystem functioning and of the climate, and they're obviously related, we believe that there are tipping points beyond which we experience highly dangerous feedback effects and runaway effects that become irreversible. So when I say that we have lost time during the last 30 years, it's not merely that we have delayed the introduction of effective measures. We have also come closer to major irreversibilities. In the case of biological diversity, these irreversibilities include species extinction and the collapse of ecosystem functioning. When it comes to climate change, last year was 1.48 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial level. In other words, we have already reached the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that was set in the Paris Agreement in 2015 to implement the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We will probably exceed the 1.5 degrees limit in 2024. Now, partly this is because of a short-term or interannual effect of El Nino, but the underlying upward trend of global warming has definitely accelerated. And we are now at a warming rate of about 0.3 degrees Celsius per decade. So we're going to overshoot the 1.5 degrees, perhaps very seriously. And that could lead to irreversible disasters. The destruction of the ice sheets, or at least part of the ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland, the slowing or even stopping of the ocean circulation, the thermohaline circulation, the melting of permafrost, and the massive release of methane and CO2 buried beneath the permafrost, and of course the loss of species that cannot migrate successfully in the context of a warming climate and which reach thermal limits beyond which they can't survive. And that's true of both plants and animals, and many alpine species which have been climbing up the mountainsides, but the mountains have peaks, and beyond that, the warming will lead to the destruction of the habitat of these species. In general, the world market economy does not send the right signals either for climate change or for biodiversity conservation. Markets do not incorporate the losses of natural capital in any direct way. These are, from an economic theory point of view, external effects that are not captured by market forces. And as much as we have discussed for the last 40 years, actually, these external effects, we have not succeeded in internalizing them or bringing them under control. Now, when it comes to biological diversity, I would say the challenge is even more complicated than the climate challenge. When it comes to the climate challenge, which includes the land use regulations, there is at least a pathway that can be identified for how the world's energy systems can be transformed in order to stop the CO2 emissions related to fossil fuel use. And when it comes to the other greenhouse gases, methane and nitrous oxide, at least a sketch of what needs to be done. When it comes to biological diversity, I would say that every biome, every ecosystem, every local land use environment presents its own challenges, which are very complex, which do not lend themselves to easy market-based solutions where one simply adjusts a market price, for example, and thereby creates an incentive that leads to the right outcomes. Because when we're talking about biological diversity, it's very hard to put a price on biological diversity. We don't easily correct the market failures that lead to the destruction of species and lead to the destruction of the functioning of the ecosystems. So when it comes to what to do, the challenges of biological conservation are extraordinarily complex. They cannot easily be summarized in the way that the climate agenda can be summarized. With the climate agenda, well, even there, of course, it's complex, but with the climate agenda, we say things like decarbonize the energy system by 2050, or reach net zero emissions by 2050. When we discuss the same issues with regard to biological diversity, we say protect a certain amount of land area, or stop or slow the destruction of habitat, or the extinction rates, and so on. But these are goals that are not easily turned into policies with effect. And so my own observation of these processes that I've been involved in a diplomatic level for the last 25 years on a daily basis is that both the climate agenda and the biodiversity agenda are complicated, but I would say the biodiversity agenda is even more complicated and less successful in terms of any kind of public awareness, set of policies, or measures of implementation. I think it's right to say we are on a path that is designed typically in the relevant species, or the number of members of species, so the species abundance is in decline, whether it's fisheries or whether it's forests, or whether it's different classes of species, amphibians or pollinators or other groups. And we do not have effective mechanisms to address this decline that are actually working and operational. So what to do? My own approach, which I advocate for all issues, and I should say that when it comes to sustainable development, we're talking about not only the environmental crises, but also the social crises, the economic crises, the problems of extreme poverty. We have 17 SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, after all. We have the climate crisis and so forth. My own view is that we need much more detailed specification of our objectives, of the ways to achieve them, and of their incorporation into national plans on a scientific basis. And then the identification of the policy instruments, whether it is economic incentives, regulation, land use, protected areas, and so forth, for how the scientifically specified objectives can be achieved. And then a systematic and frequent monitoring mechanism so that we are not simply meeting every 5 or 10 years to understand how bad things are going, but actually reporting almost in real time using extensive satellite data and ground truthing data so that we have a rapid feedback of data to confirm or disconfirm whether we are on the right track, and to enable not only monitoring and understanding the state of affairs, but also enforcement mechanisms that typically mean enforcement against illegal actions like illegal fishing or illegal clearing of forests or illegal use of scarce fresh water supplies and so forth. So planning, incentive structures, and monitoring mechanisms are all essential. I know that in a sense this exists in the area of biological diversity because the Kunming-Montreal Protocol is supposed to do this, but it is extremely weak. I can go an entire year without hearing one policymaker or one ambassador or one finance minister even mention the Convention on Biological Diversity, much less discuss how it is being enforced or implemented or incentivized. I hear almost nothing about this agenda at the UN or among policy makers. So you are the scientists and the experts, but I can tell you it is not in the active domain of the policy community. Now, I do also need to stress that even the climate agenda, which is much more visible, is also not being implemented because, well, it raises a number of questions, which I'll mention briefly. But the biodiversity agenda is way down on the list of awareness, of priority, of budgets, and of specific mechanisms for implementation. And it's more complicated because there aren't simple rules of what to do. These policies need to be implemented with a tremendous local knowledge everywhere. So only local ecologists can save their own local ecosystems because outsiders don't know, don't care, and are not in a position to set policies and plans for success. One more basic point that I want to emphasize, and then I'll talk about a couple of the obstacles, and then we can open it up for discussion. Whether it is the climate agenda or whether it is the biodiversity agenda, regional cooperation between neighboring countries is typically essential. And everything that I've said about how hard this is involves another level of difficulty, which is active cooperation among neighboring countries. Governments do not work very well together in a detailed way on just about anything, but in the areas of shared biomes, a shared river system, a shared forestry, a shared fisheries, cooperation sometimes exists on paper, but in practice, it's quite limited. Usually in a rivershed, the upstream countries do what they want, and the downstream countries try to adjust to the consequences. When it comes to fisheries, the illegal fishing is pervasive. Fleets come in and they hope to avoid detection. They catch the fish and they leave, but enforcement is very weak. When it comes to shared forest regions, it is very hard to get agreements on a shared forest biome to limit deforestation or logging, especially of highly valued tropical forest products. And so regional cooperation is both vital and difficult. This is true also in the climate area on energy transformation. In general, a low carbon energy system requires interconnections across national borders because when it comes to intermittent energy sources like wind, solar, and hydro, it's better to connect those in a large grid to reduce the variability by smoothing across a number of different sources rather than having one country at a time make its own energy system. But getting that kind of regional grid requires a lot of political trust, a lot of market organization, a lot of shared regulation, and so on. All of this is made complicated by our geopolitical environment. The United States is a very bad behavior, in my view, right now. The US government is more interested in its power, its military advantage, its dominance, than it is in sustainable development. I almost never hear a constructive word coming out of Washington about these topics. The only thing Washington is interested in is war, the military, and competition with China and competition with Russia. And this is all extremely short-sighted and dangerous and nasty, I have to say. So the geopolitical environment is also extremely difficult. Now, finally, let me just say what a world should be doing. And when it comes to land use and biodiversity, let me emphasize a very basic point, which you know, which is that sustainable management of ecosystems is critical both for the climate goals as well as for the biodiversity goals, because around 1/3 of all of the greenhouse gas emissions come from land use change, deforestation, and unsustainable forms of agriculture. And so this means that if we're going to address the climate agenda, we intrinsically need to address the conservation agenda. We need to stop deforestation. We need to protect the ecosystem functions because they not only contribute directly to the biodiversity objectives, but they also contribute to the climate objectives. And of course, they're fundamental for many other objectives as well, for public health, for example, for access to safe water supplies, and so on. So this agenda of sustainable land use, conservation, and ecosystem protection is a pervasive objective, but it is a difficult one. It's difficult scientifically, and it's very difficult to implement. The first thing that I have always wanted to see is a rigorous approach to land use planning that satisfies the needs of biological diversity conservation. My guru was the wonderful scientist Edward Wilson, who was a teacher of mine and a friend and a colleague. And he said, protect half the earth. And I always wanted to know which half. Where do we draw the lines? How do we determine this? For each country, can we show on a map where agriculture and cities can be and where the protected areas should be designated? I want the scientists to help us understand this. This obviously intersects very closely with the agriculture challenges. So ecologists and agronomists need to be working intimately together, because the biggest challenge to biodiversity is probably the agriculture sector. It's the extension of farmlands, croplands, pasture lands. It's the drainage of water for irrigation. Agriculture is the great driver of land use change and of unsustainability and biodiversity loss. And yet the agronomists and the conservationists tend to view each other as enemies rather than as colleagues for how to actually draw the right maps to say, here's what can be done here, and here's what should not be done here. Now, suppose we had an ideal map of the world that identified where the reserves should be, where agriculture should be under different conditions, how the rivershed should be used, how the fisheries should be controlled, and so forth. Suppose we knew that by the magic of ecological sciences, we would then face the question, how could such a vision actually be implemented? Because it would not be consistent with market forces. Market forces would say, chop down those trees and grow palm oil, deforest and open up more pasture land, and so forth. So the incentive questions become very crucial. Once we know what to protect, then we need a structure how to protect them. Let me just observe that we do not have even a basic incentive structure for conservation almost anywhere in the world. There is almost no active valuation of ecosystem services. There is no funding to keep forests standing. There is very little enforcement of mechanisms like tradable quotas for fisheries. Forests are routinely chopped down, even when they are designated as reserved areas, because illegal logging is quite profitable typically. I was taken a few years ago in Borneo, in Kalimantan, to a protected region, and all I saw for 50 kilometers was trucks carrying out giant tropical logwoods on their way to the Chinese market. So it was completely being deforested, but in name, it was a protected area. So we need incentive structures and enforcement structures that don't exist. There are basically, there are several kinds of tools that in principle could be used. We could be paying communities to protect the nature, even paying indigenous communities, for example, to be active stewards and guardians of their ecosystems. We could be paying to keep land areas intact rather than utilized. But the funding for that barely exists at the international level in any scale. So we have demonstration projects, small scale projects, but we don't have anything like the scale of resources that would be needed for this kind of protection. Another kind of regulation is to enforce rules of sustainability within global supply chains. So a buyer of tropical logwoods would have to certify that the source of those logs is a sustainable source, or the purchaser of soybeans from Brazil would have to certify that the soybeans did not come from a deforested margin of the Amazon, and so forth. And Europe is trying to introduce such supply chain rules. They're very rudimentary, and most of the supply side countries, whether it's the Southeast Asian countries that provide palm oil, or whether it is the South American countries that provide feed grains and meat products, resist this kind of regulation. They don't want it, they don't like it. And so really implementing this kind of sustainable supply chain rule, I think, is promising but very difficult. Then comes the enforcement issue. Almost any of these mechanisms is subject to cheating and subject to illegal activities. And in order to enforce such agreements, there needs to be policing, and there needs to be very active monitoring. I think one of the most important good points is that with satellite data, we can have daily monitoring. In fact, we can create real-time data on where deforestation is taking place or where ships are where they should not be in fishery zones and so on. So we have the capacity for monitoring that is much, much greater than it was ever before, because it can be done remotely and digitally. But still, we haven't implemented such systems in a detailed way. So maybe I'll pause here just to say we're running out of time. We need the scientists to say, here is what to do. Here are the rules that could actually be put in place. Then economists like myself can probably help by coming along and saying, here are incentive structures or regulations or financial mechanisms that can help to enforce what you, the conservation biologists, have identified as the substantive need in order to achieve the conservation goals that the world has set. Then, of course, we have the ultimate issue of trying to get the attention of our governments. For me in the United States, this is especially hard because my government is especially nasty, I would say, incompetent and corrupt. And so it's rather difficult to get their attention because they're much more interested in war than they are in peace. And they're much more interested in unilateralism than they are in cooperation. But we have to try. So this is maybe where I'll stop and turn it back over to you for discussion.
On April 13th, Iran launched more than 300 drones and missiles towards Israel following a deadly Israeli attack on the Iranian consulate in Damascus. It's the first time Iran has directly attacked Israel, while Israel is weighing how it's going to respond to Iran's attack. And global leaders at the same time are saying, hey, you need some restraint here. The U.S. said that it wants to see these tensions de-escalate and that it wouldn't join Israel in any military retaliation against Iran. Question for me is the U.S. doing enough, though, to restrain Israel?
Probably not at some level. I think Israel will do something. It won't be helpful to anything. Israel started this round of escalation with the attack on the diplomatic compound in Damascus. Pretty brazen. I'd say more than pretty brazen, very brazen. Rather illegal, contrary to the Geneva Conventions on attacking diplomatic sites, a clear escalation, and I think clearly intended to pull the U.S. Into a war with Iran, which is probably Netanyahu's dream. I don't think that's going to work. It's a terrible idea, terrible for Israel, terrible for the United States.
And the U.S. has been pretty unequivocal about that. Biden said we're not getting pulled into a military war.
Right, and Netanyahu seems to think that he really runs the U.S. government, and sometimes it feels
not
that
always
way.
wrong. Yeah.
Exactly, sometimes it feels that way. So he doesn't take Biden at face value in that sense. He thinks he can manipulate things or force the hand of the United States or get the U.S. to come meekly behind what Israel says, because after all, the U.S. keeps saying no red lines, ironclad commitment, and all the rest. But it's been clear this is not what the U.S. should do and what it wants to do. But Netanyahu is provoking. I do think, again, though there are some serious uncertainties about what really happened with the Iranian attack, it seems more likely than not that there was some pretty bad news for Israel in that several apparently hypersonic missiles got through and hit their targets. that's got to be absolutely alarming for Israel. So I think purely on a military calculation, this was not a good week for Israel.
And also in terms of the perception of Israel, prior to October 7th, there was an idea that they were almost impenetrable, at least at home. And now the fact that Hamas was able to sort of successfully breach the borders, the fact that, we see things going on all around the globe that makes Israel look weak, does that provoke Israel to engage in more aggressive activity?
Well, I think it has deeply called into question the strategy and the tactics of this particular cabinet. This is an extremist, nationalist Israeli cabinet, the most extremist in history. It does believe in a greater Israel. It does believe in permanent apartheid or worse, ethnic cleansing, or whatever is needed for Israel to keep its control and to prevent a Palestinian state. And what is happening is that fundamentally the world does not support that agenda. The world, even the United States, and I would say the American public, is pretty aghast at what they've seen. And even the political class in the U.S., which is absolutely, typically 100% behind Israel, is shocked and not going down that line. So Israel's got itself into a terrible mess because of its extremism, doesn't know what to do. Netanyahu's normal modus operandi is when you're in a mess, escalate. And that, I think, is still probably odds on to what they'll try to do.
The U.S. has historically taken a very aggressive stance toward Iran, including pulling out of the Iran deal in 2018. For decades, they've imposed economic sanctions under multiple presidents, with more announced after the attack over the weekend. The U.S. has also allied with Israel and Arab countries like the UAE, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, all against Iran. Has U.S. policy in the Middle East enabled the possibility of a wider war?
Well, I think the first point, the most decisive thing that's happened vis-a-vis Iran is that Iran and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia have had a rapprochement. They're going to be together, it seems, in the BRICS, in this enlarged grouping, although with Saudi Arabia it's not 100% clear that that's the case. But definitely there has been a diplomatic reconciliation of sorts. Israel's war in Gaza, which has been so much more shocking and devastating than people would have imagined, have really pushed Iran and the Arab world closer together, not farther apart, despite what Israel hopes and what U.S. strategy has been. So I don't think that the U.S. And Israel can maintain any kind of coalition with the major Arab countries against Iran at this moment. Israel is making that absolutely impossible because of Israel's extremism. That puts the U.S. On the back foot vis-a-vis China, for example, which has been diplomatically extremely successful in the Middle East. It was interesting in the UN Security Council session after the Iranian attack, you also heard, even from an American ally as close as Korea, some words of caution against Israel that you would not normally have heard. Korea depends on the Middle East for its energy. It does not want this thing to explode. So I think at the core of this is a failed Israeli political strategy.
Not a failed U.S. Middle East policy over decades.
Well, more fundamentally, absolutely, the U.S. has enabled a failed Israeli strategy, a terrible one. So I do completely agree that that the U.S. policy in the Middle East is failing terribly. It's leading to wider war. Even if the U.S. wants to restrain that, it's not restraining the wider war. Why? Because at the crux of this conflict is an unsolved political problem with Israel and Palestine that absolutely needs to be solved. And all of the anti-Iranian dimensions have a very large source in the Palestine-Israel conflict, after all. There's no intrinsic
reason why Iran would be the great enemy of the United States. Even with all the history, the U.S. has a lot to apologize for to Iran, starting in 1953 with the overthrow of the democratic government and the installation of a police state, after all. So there could have been a rapprochement between the U.S. and Iran. I've always wanted that. I thought the U.S. should have signed the JCPOA and implemented it. And of course, that was subverted by Trump. Biden was weak, as he has been in so many areas, of not bringing that back to life. Biden has been weak in allowing Netanyahu to continue his extremist agenda. And here we are with massive failures building up, not just in the Middle East, but we have crises all over the world. And I would say it's because U.S. foreign policy is out of date, outmoded, and with weak leadership.
You talked about this sort of enduring problem in the Middle East, specifically in Israel-Palestine. There's been a lot of renewed interest in Israel-Palestine, specifically around the so-called two-state solution.
Yes.
The U.S. has always said they've supported the two-state solution, whatever that might mean to them. And they have always articulated that as a kind of pathway toward Palestinian statehood. They want Israel and Palestine to negotiate directly in this regard. That's been a U.S. position. You know, I'm not sure how viable or possible that is.
Well, you know, my thought is, okay, yeah, there have been negotiations now for decades. We're done with that phase. Now we implement the two-state solution.
Right.
It's been clear all the way back to the Six-Day War in 1967 what the outcome has to be, which is a state of Palestine on the pre-war borders and a state of Israel, and they're living side by side. They may not like each other. Maybe there's a barrier between them, but there are two states. And this has been clear for 57 years. The U.S. has said...
Let me push back on that for
Yes.
two reasons. One, there seems to be a growing sense in the global community, and certainly among Palestinian civil society, that the two-state solution is actually not only undesirable, but non-viable.
Right.
Because of settlement expansion, because of Israel's refusal to stand down on this claim of greater Israel, all of it is ours. That really there's a one-state reality that can only be repaired with a one-state solution, a single secular democratic state.
Yeah, I think that right now there's an overwhelming sentiment in the world to implement the two-state solution, which has been on the table and is embodied in probably dozens of UN General Assembly and Security Council resolutions over many, many decades. On both sides of this divide, which is a terrible, brutal divide, there is a one-state solution. Of course, many in Palestine say one state, Palestinian majority, and that's it. On the Israeli side, we know this current government is for one state, completely an Israel-dominated state. My view is that, practically speaking, these two sides do not get along, and there maybe in future generations, someday they will get along. But for the moment, the right answer is the one that has been embodied in resolution after resolution, but never enforced. And I agree, we're coming to the end of that road. The UN Security Council is getting ready for a vote on Palestinian membership in the UN based on the two-state solution.
What does that mean? Talk to me about what that means as a practical matter. Perhaps recognition of Palestine as a state, membership
That would be
status.
phenomenal.
It'd be phenomenal. But you still have Netanyahu who's saying, perhaps as a pretext, but that post-October 7th, we can't even have a conversation about a two-state solution, that a permanent, durable solution has to include Israel having security control over Gaza and over the West Bank. If that's the case, then is this all just for nothing?
No, because I don't think Netanyahu has the final word in this. I think the world community has the final word. And if we find, as I believe to be the case, that there's an absolutely overwhelming global sentiment, this war has to stop. Israel has to stop killing the people of Gaza. The two sides do not have to trust each other, love each other, like each other, even tolerate each other, but they have to coexist side by side without the killing. I think that this means saying to Netanyahu and this extremist government, If you can't implement that, it's going to be a different one onward. But this is the will of the international community under the UN Charter. And that, I believe...
Israel doesn't find the UN Charter very persuasive.
Yes, but Israel depends entirely on the U.S. backing to repudiate the UN Charter.
So that's the point that I
Yes.
that I want to drill down on
Yes.
a little bit. It seems to me that it's far more important for the United States to assert its power than for the international community. Israel says, hey, ICJ, we don't care. ICC,
correct.
we don't care. Geneva Convention's not so important. But if Biden makes that call and says, hey, no more money, hey, no more vetoes.
I would put even more explicitly, just no more bombs.
Fair enough.
You can't fight tomorrow without our munitions,
Yeah.
which is literally the case. So I think that's right. The U.S. will not do that just on its own by saying, oh, it would be nice to have a two-state solution. It will not do that. On the other hand, if the overwhelming global majority says that's the right way, then the U.S. has a different choice.
Hasn't that always been the case? I mean, for the last few decades, hasn't the global community effectively spoken out against the settlements in the West Bank, effectively said that funding for Israel should be conditional upon human rights abuses going away, but we still see the siege in Gaza?
Yes.
The international community hasn't been unclear about this.
No, I agree. It has not been unclear, and the U.S. has been temporizing, protecting Israel, and delaying up until now. Now we have, I believe, a genocide underway. I think it is absolutely a disaster, and I think the world community is more alarmed and more shocked and more saying, if we are anything as a world community, we have to implement what we've said. An example, the vote on membership is a vote that should have happened 13 years ago.
Absolutely.
Because this was an application by the Palestinian Authority in 2011 for membership. When you make that application, it goes to an admissions committee, a new members committee, which is constituted by the UN Security Council. They did all the work. They said Palestine qualifies. The U.S. blocked it. And the U.S. blocked it saying, it's not quite right now, not quite time. But take observer status. That's pretty good, and soon enough you'll be a member. Now we're 13 years later. There is a genocide underway in Gaza. There is the risk of a wider war. It's true. You could say, well, Mr. Sachs, wasn't all of this true 13 years ago? I would say, yes, it was true 13 years ago. But 13 years later, the dangers to the whole world are much greater, and the prevarications of the United States are so much more evident as well. So to my mind, I want to give another push. Okay, United States, you said back in 2011 it's going to happen quickly. We're farther and farther away because you have backed something that is against international law. You have sided repeatedly on the ground with Israel, even though it's direct violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. I want to push so that we actually live like responsible grown-ups, saying what we say, we do. We have international law, we apply it. And I think this is a moment, if again it fails and fails, well, you're absolutely right. This will go down in history as A, a disaster, and B, as a long period of hypocrisy of shocking dimension, and C, somebody will have to come up in the next generation with different answers. But right now we have an answer that is viable, workable, practicable, and the question is for the United States, are you going to apply what the whole world says is needed and what the U.S. itself says is needed, or are you going to continue to fake it? My basic argument to the U.S. is it's no good for the U.S., but it's also no good for Israel. Israel's legitimacy is shot by all of this. You go around the world, as I do all the time, people are aghast at what Israel is doing, and young people around the world are saying, what the heck is this? This kind of government has no legitimacy at all. And so Israel needs to change for its own survival.
That's my own view.
That's an interesting question that you raise. Is it time for Biden and maybe other U.S. politicians to change course? I mean, there's a way that Biden is simply following the course that every presidential candidate has followed. You stand with Israel. There's no daylight.
That's it.
There's nothing between us. But now there's a generation of voters that are looking at this differently. Since Operation Cast Lead, certainly since Protective Edge, people have said, wait a minute, that's a lot of killing. That's a lot of death.
You're absolutely right. This is the first time that the American public has really focused on this in a very long time. And what they're seeing, they don't like. And the politicians are shocked.
Yeah.
Politicians don't like kind of hanging out where the public isn't.
Yeah.
But they've been so trained. A guy like Biden, I mean, this is decades, never show any daylight between Israel and you.
It's like a certain kind of fundamentalism I'm watching here.
That's the first rule.
Yeah.
Not a word, not a peep. And he's pretty much sticking to that, except for we hear the gossip of what he calls Netanyahu, et cetera, et cetera. But
the leaks. I call those press leaks.
Exactly. but on the public pronouncements, it's the old school. Now, if Biden's not old school, what is he? I mean, he's completely old school. But what's shocking for them is it doesn't play.
Yeah.
It may play with some big donors, but it's not playing with the public, and they got to worry about the public. After all, at some point, what the public thinks matters in this country, especially in a November election.
Absolutely. Talk to me about the short term. We understand the kind of long-term goals here around statehood, around kind of creating a kind of global peace. But in the short term, people are dying and
Absolutely.
People are starving. How do we get to a ceasefire right now?
The reason we don't have a ceasefire right now is actually the long term, strangely enough. There's no endpoint even agreed. That's why Israel won't even agree to a permanent ceasefire. It says maybe ceasefire for 3 weeks or 6 weeks. Hamas says, well, that just means they're going to come back and slaughter us 6 weeks from now. Why doesn't Israel agree to something longer? Because then people ask, well, what is longer? And when Israel says, well, we're in control, no, that can't be longer. That's not an answer. So you have to have a point on the horizon where you're heading. That's why I want to clarify that by saying two-state solution, Palestine, member of the United Nations. We know where we're heading. There are a lot of details to work out in implementation, but we know where we're heading. So we're not arguing, BB, about that anymore. It's not what you care, what you say, what Smotrich says, what Ben-Gvir says about 2 states, 1 state, 3 states, greater Israel. That's done. The world's spoken. We know where we're going. Now we have to stop the fighting. To my mind, that will become absolutely directly more clear once that direction is settled. So I see it actually that many times, if even you want to start your hike up the mountain, you have to know where we're heading so you know what path you're going to follow. Once Palestine is voted in, I hope this week, really hope the United States does not block this again, because it would block it standing against the entire world.
That may be political
community.
suicide for Biden.
I think it would be. And so I'm hoping they have enough sense. Of course, these advisors need to recalibrate everything that they ever learned in politics, but they need to get this right. Then, okay, what's the point of the war anymore? Because now we have Palestine entering the UN. By the way, the clause is as a peace-loving nation. You have to accept the UN Charter. You enter as a peace-loving nation. That actually means something. It means that all of the countries in the region are oriented towards Israel's security as well as the Palestinian state security. So everybody has to take practical steps as soon as that happens. The Saudis, UAE, Qatar, Egypt, Jordan, and Israel and the United States, all the rest. Okay, we have to stop the arms flows. We have to stop the killing. We have to start with the emergency services once again. We have probably 1 million people on the brink of starvation right now, so there needs to be massive, massive infusions of emergency food aid. Of course, this could start immediately if there is a political framework. there is not going to be a political framework on a process in which it's surely not this Israeli government, but I don't think any Israeli government in the near future is going to, quote, negotiate this. But the world can say, this is international law, this is how it's going to be. Stop your dreams of greater Israel. We're moving to the two-state solution.
To that point, I'm going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball for a moment. If the global pressure mounts the way you're describing, do you see U.S.-Israel relations changing? Do you see U.S. policy toward Israel fundamentally shifting?
Fundamentally, it has to shift because it can't give a blank check. The current policy is, Israel, you tell us what you want, we stand with you ironclad and ship the money your way. That's an impossible policy. All you do if you're a big power like the United States and you tell another country that's dependent on you, you choose everything. All you do is invite the craziest kind of extremism, because they say, we got the U.S., we manipulate the U.S. Bibi thinks he runs the U.S. And as we said, he's got some evidence on his side up until now. The U.S. has to put some clear markers on this. We have a policy. We don't want to divide with the rest of the world. We don't want it to be two countries, Israel and the United States, against the other 191 countries. We have some basic standards based on the UN Charter. Once Israel hears that, things will change, but that's a big change from now, because the current policy is, Israel, you tell us what you need or what you want, we back you.
It's so profoundly weird, I would say, especially for those of us my age who experienced the Cuban Missile Crisis and the first Cold War, not the one that we're in right now, which we now see is really a continuation. It never ended in 1992, contrary to legend. I make the mistake every once in a while of actually reading the comment lines under Financial Times articles. And the Financial Times is, Gideon Rockman, for example, writes something where he maybe has a sentence or two about the nuclear threat. And then all of the comments are, what threat? Don't let them blackmail us. Basically, what's a little nuclear war among friends? So you read this in the comment section and my God, you realize also how sad it must be to be a writer or reporter when that's your readership. Oh, come on, are you kidding? Because every comment is, don't worry about it. Don't be blackmailed about it. It's not real. I bet he won't do it. Let's find out. So what? And then if somebody writes, oh my God, we should take nuclear war seriously. Russian troll, Putin apologist. The moment you say something. So it is bizarre. And we had that experience, by the way, as a little controlled trial in the U.S. Biden says nothing about this, basically. But at I think it was 2022 in the fall, he said in a fundraiser to donors, which is really the only time he speaks to the, quote, American people, when he's speaking to some rich people in a private donor fundraiser. He said, we may be on the road to Armageddon. And he used the word Armageddon. What was the reaction in the press? It was literally the Wall Street Journal the next day or the day after in the editorial page chastising the president for scaring the American people. And how dare he use a word like that? And what's gotten into him? So the norm is, don't discuss this. Don't consider this. And the idea is, probably they won't do it. It's only 10% chance the world ends. It's the most insane feature of our time right now. And again, the pain of all of this is, if one knows just a little bit of history, how false readings on radar of a
bird flock that passed the radar looked like incoming ICBMs, and or a training tape that was left on that led a nighttime supervisor in an early warning system think that there was an incoming attack. Or the most famous, or should be famous, actually it's almost unknown, I should say, but the most remarkable incident in modern human history. It's a good quiz question to ask people. Which one individual, above all, most clearly saved the world? And the man's name is Arkhipov, and he's known by 1 in a million or maybe less in the world. And he was the Soviet political officer on a disabled Soviet submarine where the skipper of the submarine had ordered the firing of a nuclear-tipped torpedo after Kennedy and Khrushchev had arrived at their compromise agreement, but the word had not reached the disabled submarine. And under U.S. military doctrine, being fired upon by any nuclear weapon, a nuclear-tipped torpedo, a tactical battlefield nuclear weapon, or a strategic nuclear weapon, was to trigger the full nuclear arsenal of the United States against Russia, Soviet Union, China, and all of Central and Eastern Europe under the Soviet regime. And the estimates of those days was 700 million deaths out of 3 billion. Of course, not taking into account the global famine that would have followed and all the rest. And we came within a second of that. And it's not even known by most. And Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers and Martin Sherwin, the great historian who died a couple of years ago and is the author of co-author of Oppenheimer, which became the movie, wrote about this in a book that everybody should read called Gambling with Armageddon. And the point of the book, which focuses on the Cuban Missile Crisis, but more generally discusses the fact that we're in the gamble with survival of the human species to an incredible extent. And he talks about this Arkhipov episode. People don't know these things. They're not thinking. They're not discussing them. They're not learning about them. And so somehow the fact that the U.S. might be embarrassed in Ukraine by not having its absolutely stupid idea of expanding NATO to Ukraine succeed is worth gambling with Armageddon. That's the situation we're in. And yes, every European leader stands up and salutes the United States in this, lies about everything, and says, sure, why risk it? And again, these leaders of the Baltic states, what the hell are they doing? They have countries of 1 or 2 or 3 million people on the border of Russia. They are not nuclear powers, but they're saying Russia must be destroyed. Are they out of their minds? Do they think the U.S. is really going to keep them safe? Do they think a nuclear war is going to just be dandy for Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania? What is on their minds? But your point is right. It's completely not understandable to me, but it is the reality that we do not have any self-control right now. And we have no capacity to understand our own behavior, maybe because it is this agenda of secretive intelligence armies for the last not even 30 years, but for the last 60 years. And it's on a kind of fixed rudder, and our politicians are useless in this. This is really where we stand. By the way, it's fascinating, and it's so hard to uncover all of this, but there's a lot of known history, and some not so known history about how the CIA immediately starting in 1945, following OSS work, started running the neo-Nazi units of Western Ukraine. The same groups, the Banderistas and others that are real. This isn't just a Russian figment of the imagination. These are literal groups with literal people who were literally on the CIA and MI6 account and were run for decades because they would help to undermine Russia or undermine the Soviet Union. So these games, which, you know, are the fun games of the James Bond movies and were mocked in Mad Magazine as the white spy and the black spy, you know, playing games with this is what's bringing us to 90 seconds to midnight right now.
I completely agree. Just again, a few points here. I mean, about the fact that there's been this disappearance of fear of nuclear war and this constant talking about the Russians bluffing. Bluffing is a word that comes from gambling. It just confirms that we are gambling on what the other side is doing, that we assume that they're bluffing, even whilst we insist that then we are not. It's an astonishing thing. And if it's the risk that they're not bluffing and that we could find ourselves in a nuclear war is 0.1%. That is too big a risk, far too big a risk. Any risk at all in this kind of situation is far too great, especially given that all of these problems which have existed and which have accumulated and which are getting worse are still problems that can be resolved properly through negotiations in a way that is not going to compromise or endanger anyone. And if we're talking about specifically the Baltic states, which are small countries next to this giant colossus, which is Russia, the best guarantor of their independence and security is Russia itself, not the superpower far away, a continent and an ocean away, which can only ultimately protect them by risking its own existence. Again, I would have thought that was obvious, and I would have thought, again, that a US president or a US administration ought to be pointing that fact out to them. And so should the other European countries, which are being led by the Baltic states into policies which I find astonishing. The influence, the sway that these Baltic states have achieved over European policy absolutely astonishes me. Now, these are not.
I can tell you, just to tell you a story about that. This Kaja Kallas, the leader of Estonia, I knew her dad actually rather well, Sim Kallas, who was in 1991 president of the Central Bank of Estonia. Estonia gained its independence in 1991. I had a very wonderful Estonian Canadian student who said, "Jeff, come to Tallinn. They need help." So I came to Tallinn back in 1991, in March 1991. Interestingly, the hotel was freezing. We had to wear a winter coat because there was no heat. There was no fuel. And I had a meeting with Sim Kallas one evening in a bar, and he described to me, "What do we do? We're in the ruble zone. We need to have we're a new nation. We need to have an independent currency." So I knew something about that. That was my my profession. So I designed basically on a napkin that evening how Estonia could make a national currency. They adopted it literally the next day, that idea, and a month later, the Estonian kroon appeared. Now, what's interesting for me is I was there. The Russians didn't try to stop it. The Soviet Union wasn't even over yet at that time. And there was no attempt by Russia to invade Estonia. There was no desire to Quite the contrary. I was working with Gorbachev's team. I was working with Yeltsin after September 1991. I was working with the Estonians on helping them to design a post-ruble currency, which went into effect. The Russians wanted peace. They wanted quiet. They wanted rebuilding. They wanted integration with Europe. It was so normal. This is exactly the moment that Cheney is saying, okay, now we dismember Russia. This is the crazed mindset of this hubristic, indispensable nation, the United States. It just could not say yes. And now I see the daughter. Yeah, I got one of the highest awards of the Estonian state for my work in helping them set up the currency, because it remained stable for the next 20 years, and then they adopted the euro. It was a good success, good economic success, especially for an evening discussion about how to set up a currency. And now I see this hatred from the Estonians, hatred, but provocation and warmongering, as if this is going to keep them safe. Are you kidding? It's completely the opposite. By the way, I was advisor to Poland in those years. I